All right, Improvisation Center is back again with the FMT, the Ford muscle truck, our 94 F150 truck that you've seen us stick a powertrain. Okay, anyway, seen us stick a V8 powertrain, 5-speed manual transmission. Last we left off, we cut a hole in the floor to accommodate the shifter, which was just a nub right there, but we managed to hit the junkyard and find we managed to find another 5-speed F-150 truck. That's the one that you will see a video of us yanking out the transmission of that. But before I did that, I actually snatched out the shifter from that transmission and couldn't get the handle off of it easily, so I just took the entire shifter with the part that goes in the transmission because I couldn't get the shifter handle off. So that kind of helped me out as far as probably making that transmission less desirable to somebody else. So I was able to come back a week later and get the thing. But anyway, I could get this stuff for the other transmission, but that transmission was pretty much like a needle in the haystack kind of find. Like you'll never find that again. That's like your golden unicorn type thing. So I still had to get it even after snatching the shifter out of it. So whatever. Got a shifter handle right here. Also managed off the same truck to get the starter and transmission mount. All shit that we needed for this truck right here. And because we got it pretty cheap at the junkyard, we saved a few bucks. So another thing we also got too is this little bung right here that goes in the side of the oil pan. For the dipstick, it's actually from a Power Stroke oil pan. They have the whole unit mounted in the side of the... Hey, shut up! Anyway, the Power Stroke dipstick bung right there is actually mounted in the sides of the oil pans on those engines. And because our engine is a hybrid combination setup, there's no... Oh, Jesus. You got something to say, chicken? Since our engine is a kind of a hybrid... Fucking chicken. Since our engine is kind of a hybrid setup where there's no port on the block or on the timing cover, there's nowhere to put a dipstick on there, so I had to resort to getting that bung right there in order to do that. So that oil pan right there that you see next to the loudmouth schnook is gonna get this bung. No, it's not that one, it's this one right here. But anyway, that oil pan right there is the one that's gonna get the bung for the dipstick. I needed to put that pan in there anyway because of the idea that the pan that's on this engine currently is not the right one for this truck. Ford switched things up yet again, despite this engine coming out of an older truck. The engine that's in these newer trucks uses that oil pan right there. So yeah, I'm gonna have to switch all that up too. But that's neither here or there. Not a whole lot left to do on this thing. Besides the shifter, the starter, and the dipstick, and the tranny mount, we also have a fuel pump that we have to mount on the side on the fuel rail so we can get fuel to this thing. At least he's way over there. But we have to install this crap. Also, still need to figure out the deal with the transmission. So, I mean, not the transmission, with the transmission yoke on the drive shaft right there, because the splines seem to be correct, but for some reason the diameter of the yokes, the outer diameter is actually off a little bit, it seems. We'll figure that out at a slightly later date. We also need some new rad hoses because, as you can see, these are trashed. And of course I need to put another rear seal on the transmission because, well, this one's kind of shitty as well. But it's all that stuff that needs to be done. And hopefully we'll be able to crank this thing up eventually. Yay. But in the meantime, shifter. All right. unlike when I was in the junkyard around our shop, when I had access to stuff like WD-40 and all, I was able to get the shaft off of this shifter here, so there's no need for me to pull the bung off of the top of this transmission. I could just go ahead and put this one on. There are some differences, however. The flat spot on the bung for our transmission is about 90 degrees off from the one that was on this shifter. So that means time to do some more improvisation to make this thing work. Otherwise, it's just going to spin around on the shaft partially, and that's not going to work when you're trying to bang shift the truck. So, yep, more improvisation as usual. All right. We managed to make the modifications necessary to allow us to use the shifter from a different variant of 5-speed with the shifting fork or whatever that thing is called for our transmission. And I ended up doing that by basically turning the shifting fork, tongue, whatever the hell you call that thing, 90 degrees to have it in an imaginary line with the transmission, so the shifter would be lined up, and then I ground a groove on the top right here where this bolt would go, because there's a flat spot on that bolt that coincides with that flat spot on this piece here. So when the bolt goes in, the bolt will lock this whole thing together. And of course, when you tighten the nut up, it holds everything nice and tight, so nothing can spin around or move around or anything like that. Like I said, these two transmissions, even though they're the M5 OD, there's apparently minute differences between either the years or the engines, even though they all fit together. Go figure. So with this all done, I can now mount the shifter and move on to other things, which I also had to modify. Stay tuned for that as well. On and get this part mounted. That there is going to involve drilling some holes. Well, you got some mismeasurement there. too big of a fucking hole. I'm gonna have to figure out how to deal with that, but that will be later. In the meantime, try to get this transmission mounted next. Weeding out the bugs comes at the end. All right, our next thing is transmission cross member and the transmission mount. And why did I have to modify this, you ask? Well, again, because things are slightly different. The mount that I managed to acquire from the junkyard transmission has a little bit wider spacing than the mount that would have went on our truck here. So, well, this mount, this cross member comes from this truck here. It sucks that I didn't get the cross member from the other truck, but that's neither here or there. Conveniently, though, Ford had these little ridges right here kind of stamped into this cross member that seemed like they were there for the reason of knowing where to cut holes for the different types of cross members. So, because of that, I was able to know exactly where to chop a couple holes using a plasma cutter and a die grinder, so I could be able to mount our mount on here. So for all intents and purposes, this cross member is multi-purpose. Now, hopefully, because of this area here being opened up, I don't have any issues with weakness. Otherwise, I will have to pull this off and re-weld any damage or even fill in some of these areas. But as everything else, as with everything else, we'll figure that out. We'll see what happens when we get to that point. In the meantime, we're trying to put all this shit together. Worst case scenario, I could always go back and get that cross member and weld some metal in there to fill that in. If I ever had to use this cross member with a different mount, it really don't matter. We can always fix this stuff. That's the best part about having the right tools on hand. Even when you fuck up something, you can always fix it back up. So we're gonna get this shit mounted. All right, we got everything mounted. Well, not everything. We got the cross member mounted. We got our tranny mount on, bolts, all that shit. Only thing I'm gonna have to do later on is drill a big fucking hole over there to coincide with that side of the tranny mount, so I could put a bolt in there and hold that end down, since all this shit is not lining up like it's supposed to. That's neither here or there. We already know the reasons why. We're matching all kinds of shit. So, yep, that's what happens. Then you got to improvise, as we always do. So, with that part done, we can move on to our next thing. Yay! All right, currently I'm under the truck here, and kind of in the middle, and got our fuel tank right there. But I'm gonna install the fuel pump. It's a decent spot because we got holes on the frame that'll hold. Got holes in the frame here that'll hold bolts that are gonna be used. Well, one bolt to hold the bracket for the fuel pump body, and we got our fuel line right here, fuel line, and we got the wire harness that was originally feeding the fuel pump assemblies for both tanks. So really, all I'm gonna do is bolt the fuel pump up to this point about right there where one of those holes are at, chop out a section of this fuel line right here so I could basically splice the fuel pump in with some rubber hose and then hook up the wires to the fuel pump, from the fuel pump over to one of the positive wires here in the wire bundle and the ground. I could use the chassis ground here, but since we have a ground right here, I'll just use these wires instead. So after that, I'm gonna have to actually see which of the wires in the dash from the old selector switch will feed the 12 volts to the line that I hook up to, so I can put a jumper in that plug in order to permanently have it wired up to feed power to this line that I'm using. So since we're not actually using the selector switch anymore, so I'm gonna go ahead, get this shit put together, get from under here. These damn chickens are annoying. All right, got our fuel pump in, wired up, ready to go. As you can clearly see, fuel pump's mounted via the bracket right there that I mentioned to the frame. Got the wires, power wires from the fuel pump tapped into the wire harness that normally fed the old fuel pumps and all that other shit. And I cut the fuel line, cut a section out, and spliced everything in with the included hoses and clamps and shit that came with the fuel pump. Now we got a inline filter as well before the fuel pump, so anything from the tank won't get into the fuel pump. It'll obviously get caught by the fuel filter. So with that, there won't be any need to put a filter up at the carburetor. We should be straight enough on that. Now the only thing is, I'll have to try to find a source for this particular kind of fuel filter here, so when these inevitably clog up, I could be able to switch them out pretty quick, because it's really just a matter of unscrewing the thing and taking the worm clamps off and swapping it all out. But yep, fuel pump's in. Like I say, I still have to find out which power wire going to this wire bundle is feeding this line here going to the fuel pump, and put a jumper in on the plug by the old selector switch, and we'll have that part done as well. So when the key comes on, the fuel pump comes on. So now our next thing is going to be to address the need for a retaining bolt for the left side of this transmission cross member. All right, got our bolts in for the transmission cross member. I ended up actually pulling the one bolt from the stock hole and just drilling a whole new hole for it just as well. But all in all, everything is in, even though we're like at the far end of the transmission mount on this transmission. Like I say again, this transmission probably, if I would guess correctly, might be a 5-speed from like a 97 or a 98 5-speed with a 4.2 V8, because they both have the same bell housing as the small block Ford. But for all intents and purposes, that's neither here or there. Transmission is in our hands. It's in. We're just gonna make it work. As we always do, we improvise. So with our cross member in, the next thing I'm gonna do is probably go ahead and start draining this oil pan, start pulling bolts off of that thing so I could go ahead and get that thing out. So that's next. Yeah, as you can see, we're making a horrendous mess. Had to pull it out this way because the front sump hitting the K-member only allows me to pull the damn thing out from the front. But hard part is done. That is out. Now we got that son of a bitch to put in, but I still have to prep the underside of the block, clean all the old gasket off and everything, and get something under there so I'm not sitting in a pool of oil, because, well, there's a pool of oil under the truck. When I dropped the pan after jacking the engine up, the pan back dropped and spilled a bunch of oil out. And then, of course, pulling the pan all the way out from the front, spilled even more oil. So, yep, we got about a good 4 quarts of oil all over the ground. This might almost be one of those situations where I might have to let that shit sit a while, or come back with some cardboard. Who knows? I'll figure it out. Either way, I got the shit out. Now, gotta lower this engine down because it's on this AC hose that's probably already fucked now. So, yep, next thing. Okay, I'm underneath the truck, looking at the engine, of course. I pulled off the oil pickup tube. I'm gonna have to replace that because it actually terminated right here where the sump was. I'm gonna need one that has a tube coming all the way back to reach to the rear here, where the rear sump would be located on the new oil pan. So, I had to see if I actually have one laying around somewhere. If not, I'm gonna have to buy another one. No big deal. The only other thing I looked at is my placement of the oil dipstick. I may have to do some trickery to manipulate a tube or something to snake around here where the motor mount and oil filter are at. Yeah, it's one of those deals where placing the side mounted dipstick kind of hard to do when you're not actually mocking it up to an engine where you can see how everything is, but we'll get it figured out one way or another. It's what we do, we improvise. If we do fuck up something, we correct it, we figure it out, and get it done. So, I'll go ahead and scrape this shit off the bottom of this block here, and move on to the next thing. Okay, right now, I think I got just about have this dipstick situation figured out. Right now, the engine is actually resting on the crossmember, K-member right here on the mounts. And the pan is temporarily bolted up. No gasket, of course, but just bolted up for fitting purposes. But I ended up orienting this dipstick to be almost horizontal. It's probably at about a 10-degree upward angle. And you can see the dipstick is forward, just under the power steering pump. Okay, a bit of angle right there. There you go. Just about under the power steering pump. And for the time being, this is a test dipstick. I'm probably not going to use this shit. If I could find some kind of brake line, fuel line tubing of similar dimensions, I could actually bend it up and then just get an extra long dipstick from something like a van or whatever that I could put in there that'll reach up better, so I don't have to reach under the power steering pump to check the oil. But anyway, using the little strap right there that's on the dipstick, along with a spacer nut and a 7/16 bolt that fits in the oil pan, I was able to secure the dipstick. Now, if I did go along with this dipstick, I would have to put something like JB Weld or something inside the filler hole right here. Well, this little port right here to help seal the dipstick in the bung right here, because none of this shit actually fits like it's supposed to anyway, because we are putting shit together in improvisation style. But that's the whole purpose of having that strap right there to hold the dipstick stationary, so even with the JB Weld or whatever in place, the shit won't move enough to where it's going to end up loosening up or anything. Now, another thing too, if we look right here, this line that I marked is actually where 5 quarts of oil would be resting. And with that angle and the length of the dipstick in this tube, it actually makes contact with that level to where the marks on the end of the dipstick do come in contact just below that line there. So if there was 5 quarts of oil in there, the marks on the end of the line would be covered by that oil level right there. So for all intents and purposes, if I really did want to, I could just go along with this setup as is and just deal with the idea of having to reach under the power steering pump in order to grab the dipstick and all. Now, of course, with everything being sealed and all, and with this level being where it's at, the end of the dipstick is actually high enough that there shouldn't be any problems with oil coming out, because we probably have a couple inches of space between the oil level and where the end of that dipstick tube is at in the front. So, like I say, for right now, this could work, but I'm going to try to see if I could find some larger tubing, metal tubing that I could bend, along with a longer dipstick, of course, so I could actually do a setup that's more convenient and practical. But for all intents, it is figured out. So, yeah, gonna go ahead and move on with the work. Got our seal here and a tool for installing it. And yeah, the tool's nothing but some PVC pipe fittings that are actually the right dimensions to accommodate this seal. So, simple little matter. Put it on here and carefully knock it in. There we go. There, you little bitch. There we go. Seals in. Now, take our drive shaft. There we go. Got our drive shaft at least seated up against the rear end. Just need to put the bolts. Get a better angle here. There we go. Got it seated up against the rear end. Just got to put the bolts in, and we'll have our drive shaft in. All right, got our oil pickup in. This is for the rear sump setup. Had to put our little nut on there to hold it to one of the main bearing caps, so now it's nice and stationary. So at this point, we go ahead and start piecing together our oil dipstick setup. I managed to get a piece of aluminum tubing for that little setup. So I'm gonna do some bends, and after that we're gonna be back under here with the pan and our makeshift dipstick tube, making some measurements and trimming the tube down and getting things ready to be put back together. Believe that shit. Have to put the damn oil pickup on with the damn pan in like this, because otherwise I would not have been able to get the pan on in any condition, front, back, whatever. I'd have had to take the damn engine off. Wasn't about to do that shit. So now I can at least get things up the way I fucking want to. All right, we finally got our dipstick tube here bent, trimmed, and set up to fit. As you can see right there, slides right into the bung. The whole tube was bent, as you can see here, to go under the oil filter and come straight up behind the power steering pump. I'll still have to trim some off of the top, depending on the length of the dipstick that I use. But for all intents and purposes, the hard part of the dipstick is done. I will end up probably using some RTV gasket maker to seal this thing up. In addition, let's see if I can move into a good position to spot it. Right up there, let me zoom in. That right there will be a clamp that'll be used to secure it to that open hole on that exhaust manifold right there. And that'll help hold the dipstick tube stationary. So even with RTV gasket maker, let me move here because I'm up under this truck. Even with RTV gasket maker sealing the end of the tube in the bung right there, securing it on the exhaust manifold will keep the whole works stationary enough that it should not leak. Now, the reason for doing that is because with the problems that are involved with removing these oil pans, more than likely, if I ever had to pull this pan again, I would end up having to pull the dipstick out. So it's going to be a lot easier in the future if I just seal it with something that could be easily removed. So yeah, that's why the RTV is probably going to be my go-to solution to seal the dipstick in there. And unfortunately, in order to get the pan on, as you've seen, I had to actually remove the oil pickup and then reinstall it inside the pan. That was a pain in the ass. So with that, now that we got the dipstick all done, we can start moving on and getting the gasket put on so we can get all this shit finished up. Been up and down under this truck about 10-15 times already. I am wore out. Hey you know you're in my spot, right? Now I'm gonna have to slide up under here and you're in my way. But you don't care apparently, don't you? Oh, okay. Bye, dog. Yay. Back to work. Alright. I, of course, took the pan back off again. Had to clean out some metal shavings and all. But I also had to test fit the dipstick in the dipstick tube. Since it's a longer tube, I couldn't use the original dipstick that I had before. So I had to actually borrow this dipstick from the El Camino over there. So at least it's a common enough engine that I should be able to find a replacement dipstick at AutoZone or even the junkyard for that matter. So it's really no big deal. But at least right now, I got the dipstick in. I trimmed the aluminum tube a little bit so I could check to see where the dipstick actually rested in the pan. And right now I have it about where it needs to be to hit the 5-quart mark that I have on the pan right there. Yeah, probably can't see it too. There we go. So it's actually right about going in there, about right there. So it's going to register when the thing is full. So now, along with our little strap there to secure it to the exhaust manifold and our oil pickup right there, I can start putting all this shit back together once and for all. Alright, got some gas and gasket. Now the fun part is fishing this thing up in here around all of the shit. Let's make sure I'm on the right end here. Fish this shit through here. right, we are more or less seated. Need to make one more verification of the rear because you can't see shit at the rear. Doesn't appear. I think we might be all right. Ow. Good, because I don't see any, but I will get a light real quick to verify that shit. All right, we got our oil pan up. Everything is in. All the bolts are in. Corner bolts are in. Our little studs that we put in actually did their job as intended. These little numbers right here help guide everything up. The gasket maker's in place on both ends in order to help seal the curved front and back portions of the gasket. So with everything in, go ahead, and the next thing I'm going to do is lower this thing down onto the K member here, so when I put the dipstick in, there won't be any issues with regard to interference, since we are pretty close to the mounts and the K member and everything where this bung is at. So with the engine in its final resting place, if there is any little fine tuning I got to do, I could do it now. So let's get to it. All right, slathered up the tip of the dipstick with some goop. We'll go ahead and get this shit seated. Probably gonna have to slather up some more in there to really ensure full coverage of the bung hole here. This is probably the messiest and shittiest way of doing this whole op right here, because of the idea that, yeah, here we go. All right, I'll go ahead and go on top, put the bolt in to hold it in, then come back under and slather some more shit on here. Alright, dipstick is secured all the way in. Push that part all the way down so it's in the oil pan where it needs to be. Go slather a little more goop in there around the bung, and we can call the dipstick completed. Alright, we also did a little addition to the dipstick tube. Took another little strap and anchored it on one of the oil pan bolts like I did with the first dipstick, in order to keep this portion stretching right here, nice and stationary, so our gasket maker here will have a chance to seal up and stay sealed up. So even when we check the oil and move the dipstick around, we're not going to have any movement that'll cause the seal to break. So with our gasket maker, our strap there, and the strap up on the exhaust manifold, our dipstick is completed. So now, next thing I think I'm going to do is put our starter in over here. That is next. All right, got our starter in, got the main power cable hooked up to it, solenoid start wire hooked up to it, everything's neat with zip ties, going all the way back up right here to the main terminal, battery cable terminal. So our starter is completed. Yeah, now exhaust pipes. Wow. All right. Okay. Got that done. Now, throw a little bit of a burn on these couplings here to establish those little fuckers, and we can write off the exhaust system. Well, even though those welds look like shit, this system is pretty well solid. It's not going anywhere. I put enough shitty bead along that other side of those couplings that I'd have to almost bottom this thing out on rocks before some of this shit breaks free. If I have any, I'll probably put some U-clamps on here just for shits and giggles anyway, but that'll be at a later date. I just wanted to get everything hung right now, which it is definitely hung right now. So last but not least is rad hoses. Fucker. Okay, these hoses are on. Hoses are on now. I'm gonna end up having to check the fan later for clearance. Make sure all this shit is not gonna come in contact with one another. But for all intents and purposes, we are done with the rad hoses. And it's fucking dark outside, or it's getting dark. There are only a few things left to do on here. A few little hoses here and there, carburetor, distributor wires, and of course the fan like I mentioned. After that, should be able to actually crank this damn thing. Oh, and I also have to bleed the clutch master cylinder. Those are the only things left. After that, then we can crank this thing. So, until the next time, click the like and subscribe to the channel. Show us some support. Share us. Do all that good stuff for us. Positive comments are, of course, welcome all the time, as are some suggestions to any little ideas that you might want to see us try out around here, or with some that we're currently working on. But until the next time, I'm going to clean up and take my ass inside because it's cold and I'm hungry. So, see you later. For a minute, got to install the electric fuel pump. What we're looking at right now is this, so everything will be in there nicely. Snare bad one. And I fucked up. Yes, I did. Bastard.